Hey everybody, it's Ed. Two quick announcements before we get started. Number one is I want to thank a whole lot of brand new podcast supporters. John Barker, Richard Burrell, Tess Varner, Andrew Daniels, Brad Gorman, Joe Eck, Derek Michael Dillon, Jill Olson, and Jay Jeffrey. Thank you very, very much to all these folks and as well to everybody who's supported the podcast over the years. If you want to learn more about how all that works, you can go to mountaineerprairie.com/support. And second is I want to thank my friends at Ranchlands for their generous support of this episode. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, then I'm sure you are familiar with my friends at Ranchlands. Ranchlands is a ranch management company that manages large-scale ranches across the American West. You've probably heard me discuss the various ways you can get involved with Ranchlands. You can take vacations at some of their ranches. You can read their excellent blog. You can check out their handmade leather goods at the Ranchlands Mercantile and much, much more. But I wanted to be sure you knew about their newest offering, and that is Ranchlands Meat. That is right. Ranchlands is now selling meat directly to consumers, and it's ground beef that's 100% grass-fed and finished. This nutrient-dense protein is bursting with robust flavor that comes from grazing rich pastures of grasses on their ranches around the West. The meat's a 90-10 grind, which means it's lean, and it also has no pesticides, no antibiotics, no animal byproducts, grain, or hormones. It's really, really, really good stuff. There's one thing I've learned from all my podcast conversations with ranchers and farmers is that it's extremely important to know where your food comes from and to support the producers who work so hard to put the food on our table. Ranchlands Meat gives you an opportunity to procure healthy, clean meat for your family and directly support the conservation-minded ranchers who are producing it. Seems like a win-win to me. Ranchlands offers volume discounts for orders over 20 pounds. So go to ranchlands.com to learn more. Thanks a lot. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guest today is Rick Ridgeway. Rick is a world-renowned mountaineer and adventurer who's devoted his life to exploring some of the wildest regions of planet Earth, from the summit of K2 to the jungles of Borneo to the mountain ranges of the American West and much more. Rick is also a highly regarded author, director, and producer who's written 7 books and created numerous films and television shows. His newest book is titled Life Lived Wild: Adventures at the Edge of the Map. It's an excellent memoir that dives deep into his adventures, friendships, environmental advocacy, and his pursuit of purpose-driven work. Rick was born and raised in California, and when he was a teenager, his mother gave him a subscription to National Geographic, which ignited his passion for climbing and adventure. Early in his climbing career, Rick ticked off some unbelievably difficult climbs around the world, most notably being the first American to summit K2. But as he grew older and more experienced in the mountains, he shifted his focus away from pursuing adventure just for adventure's sake. Over time, he began to use his skills as an athlete and explorer to advance more purpose-driven causes, such as wildlife conservation and environmental advocacy. Rick's commitment to living a purpose-driven life is beautifully detailed in his new book, Life Lived Wild, a book that I absolutely loved and highly recommend. I had the pleasure of recording this conversation with Rick in person just before he did a book signing at the Patagonia store in Denver. I've long admired Rick, and one of his earlier books played a huge role in my personal development, so it was an honor to have the opportunity to sit and talk with him for an hour. We started out discussing how and when he first began climbing, and how he grew from an amateur climber into a world-class mountaineer. We talk a lot about mentorship, how he was mentored by climbing and environmental luminaries Yvon Chouinard and Doug Thompkins, and how he mentored many up-and-coming climbers, including Jimmy Chin. We talk about his commitment to taking action and to being a doer, his success as an entrepreneur, and his 15-year tenure leading Patagonia's sustainability initiatives. We talk about what brings Rick hope in the face of the climate crisis, how the pandemic affected him, and, as you'd expect from such a skilled writer, Rick offers tons of excellent book recommendations. One quick note on the recording. We recorded this episode at a very cool co-working space across the street from the Patagonia store, so there's a little more background noise than normal. I don't think it's distracting, and I don't think it takes away from the conversation, but I just wanted to give you a heads up and let you know why you may hear a few random voices in the background during the episode. Huge thanks to Rick for taking the time to chat with me and to Patagonia Books for setting it all up. Meeting Rick was really a dream come true for me, so I hope you enjoy this conversation. So I was thinking I wanted to start out the conversation with a thank you to you because, as I just mentioned to you a second ago, I'm from North Carolina. I went to college in North Carolina. I had this dream of doing things in the mountains, but I didn't know how to go about it. And somebody gave me Seven Summits book that you wrote, and I read it, and that was the first thing that popped in my head and gave me the hope that, yeah, a normal guy like me could possibly go and do things in the mountains. And I always think of that book, no joke, as being the first domino in this long string of dominoes that eventually led me to move west and led to my career in conservation and this podcast. And so the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you about your newest book, it kind of blows my mind. So anyway, thank you very much for writing that book and for everything you've done. It's amazing to sit here and talk to you. So thank you.
Well, Ed, the thanks goes back to you as well because it takes a lot of work to write one of these things. And when that resonates with somebody, and especially when it not only resonates, but perhaps alters their path, sends them on a little different direction, that means everything to me. And it more than makes all that work worthwhile. So thank you. Yeah,
well, no, it goes both ways. Thank you. And I was thinking maybe a good place to start would be talking about the experience you had when you were a kid, when you looked at a magazine and it kind of got this idea in your head of what you wanted to be when you grew up. And I don't want to rehash the entire book because I want people to read it because it's so great. But could you just kind of set the stage as to that first moment when you decided, all right, this is what I want to do?
Yes. When I was a young teenager, actually a preteen, my parents separated. But I didn't really realize they separated. My father left us where we lived in a small ranchette in Orange County, south of Los Angeles, when it was still rural, and moved to Northern California to fix up a ranch that my parents had bought. And the story they told my brother and me was that when the ranch was fixed up, the family would get together there.
Yeah.
And I followed my father to Northern California. So I was living with him, not knowing that my parents were actually splitting up. They kept that secret from me and my brother. And then as I left, my mother had given me a subscription to National Geographic. I had a lifelong fascination with remote places, remote landscapes, wild places. She knew that.
Yeah.
And I loved that magazine. One day it came in the mail with the story of the first American ascent of Mount Everest in 1963. And inside was a photograph of Jim Whittaker, the first American to climb Everest on the summit, holding his ice axe with strong winds, whipping the flags of the United States and National Geographic. And I saw that photograph and just said, that's what I want to do. I want to be that guy. And a few months later, my best friend at that time, his family invited me to join them at their summer vacation on a lake higher in the Sierras.
Okay.
And across the lake in the background was this rising, sharp-sided mountain. It was called Thunder Mountain. And I looked at my buddy and I said, let's go climb that. Because I was thinking of Jim Whittaker.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And he said, well, my parents won't let us do that. And I said, let's just tell them we're going on a long hike. So we went on a long hike. And at the base of the steep section, we looked up and I think he was a little intimidated. I was, truth be told, but we kept going. We got to one steep section that was actually a little vertical step. We couldn't figure out how to get up it. So I said, I've got an idea. And I stood on his shoulders. I grabbed the top of the ledge and then held on for everything I had while he crawled up my leg pants.
Wow.
And then coming down, we made the summit. Coming down, we we jumped on that, over that vertical section, careful not to roll and tumble all the way down. And I was hooked.
Yeah.
That was how I got started. Later, after I discovered my parents were separating, I returned to Southern California to spend the rest of my high school years with my mother. And by then, this rural place that I'd grown up in was metamorphosed. The orange groves were gone. They had been taken over, plowed over, replaced with housing tracts.
Yep.
And I was crushed. Those were the places I'd explored as a kid. The Santa Ana riverbed, where I hunted with my single-shot .22, had been channelized with concrete.
Yep.
And I started to flee to the mountains surrounding the Los Angeles basin on my own in my little motor scooter, as escape, as a place to find solace. And I started climbing the mountains there, and including trying to do them in the winter when I got to ice sections where I realized, I can make a mistake and really get hurt here.
Yeah.
So I thought of that photograph of Jim Whittaker. I found a shop that sold ice axes and crampons. I bought gear that looked just like his. And I bought a manual, the only thing I could find that looked like a tutorial how I was going to use these things. And that made my mother's maternal radar start to bleep pretty loudly. So she, as a high school graduation present, sent me to Outward Bound.
Nice.
I learned basic rock climbing and mountaineering skills, and I was on my way.
Well, that similar, after I read your book, my next step was Knolls. And I'd done a similar thing where I'd bought I didn't have any real mountains nearby, but I bought a harness so I could swing out of the tree in my neighborhood and rappel out of my window, my second story window. And then when I got to Knolls, I realized that I had not been doubling back my harness. I hadn't been locking the beaners. So I was kind of like you. I was lucky that I made it to Knolls, but what a wonderful experience those Knolls and Outward Bound are. I mean, just wonderful.
Terrific. And look at what we have in common already.
Yeah.
This is kind of fun, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And we both
really
made it
is.
through the gauntlet. We're sitting here
we made
alive, talking to each other.
I think if you can make it through about age 13, you're as a little boy, I think you're doing all right. So your book, that launched you onto this life of adventure. And the book lays it out in such, we could sit here and talk for 10 hours and not even scratch the surface of everything you've done. But that part you mentioned when you came back to Southern California, you saw the development. I underlined that section because I felt like after reading the whole book, that seemed to be a real turning point in your mind as far as, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but this focus on conservation and focus on wild places. And I noticed, as you went pretty hardcore, pretty quick, going to Mount Everest and going to the Himalayas, going to China, and pretty soon there seemed to be a part of your career where you continued with these really hardcore adventures, but there was more to it than just the adventure. It was tied to a cause, to a conservation cause. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe that, not really transformation, because it seems like it was always there ever since you were a kid, but maybe that kind of transformation of going on to climb big mountains for the sake of climbing big mountains to using these skills and this toughness for bigger causes. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, Ed. And that's a long answer.
Yeah.
Because it is the actual theme of the book.
Yeah.
But it, as you said, started, as I explained to your listeners, with that shock, deep disappointment of seeing my boyhood playground, paved over, converted to human development, as we call it today. And these things in our lives are very seldom epiphanous, I think, that rather changes like that are made over often the length of our lifetimes, gradually, experience by experience. But as I got older, I did realize how transformational that experience in my young boyhood, in my early teen years was to me. And I didn't fully appreciate that, I think, until later. But to answer your question about this arc in my life, let me go back, if I can, to the actual genesis of the book, because that's where the answer to your question lies. And this book it's my 7th book. The previous ones have usually taken a little over a year to write. This one was over 2 years.
Wow.
And the reason it took so long was because in its first version, it was a collection of stories. They were, of course, had the connective tissue of being my life. But other than that, they weren't interconnected. And plus, there were a lot of them. There were like 52 stories when I got the book done. And it was it was scheduled for publication, but two of those stories were about a misadventure I had in my early 20s when, with a friend, a woman who I was traveling with, one of my best friends at the time, we were both arrested in a kind of, it was a business scheme that went bad. And just to perhaps provide a little bit of enticement to listeners to the book, it was a scheme to buy 22 shells, trade them with Colombian indigenous people mining for emeralds, and then take the gemstones and sail them to Fiji and sell them and buy an island and start a tourist resort. And it was a long time before I learned some of the strengths and weaknesses of a sound business plan. But let's just say back then I didn't know what a business plan was. We got arrested. And we were thrown in jail, and it was a very tough experience.
It seemed like it from the way you wrote it. It was awful.
The length of time I was in jail, I saw 5 guys get killed with my own eyes. That's how tough it was. And I was, 21 years old. So Candace, my friend, was thrown in the women's prison, and she had a tough time of it too. So I had written this story up in the original version of this book, and I needed her permission to publish them because they were raw. They were raw. And I talked about her experiences that I learned from her when finally we both got out. And I had lost touch with her. I knew that she'd become a lawyer in Marin County, a very successful one, a prosecutor, district attorney. And I hadn't seen her or talked to her for like 4 decades, or over 3 anyway, 30 plus years. So I found her on Facebook and got a hold of her, and I told her I'd written this book and I needed her permission to publish these 2 stories. And she said, well, can I read the whole book? And I thought, I guess. I was nervous because I didn't know what I was going to do if she didn't like it. I didn't know what I was going to do if she didn't like the 2 stories she was in. So she said, give me a couple weeks. I sent her the book. And then 2 weeks later, she called back and said, well, I've read it. And I go, what do you think? And instead of answering my question, she said, who do you want to read the book? And I said, oh, I don't know, friends, adventurers, explorers, people with interests similar to mine. Well, what do you want them to learn from it? And I said, I don't know. And I was thinking to myself, Candace, I know you're a lawyer. I feel like I'm being cross-examined. And then she said, well, I think you need to think about this because you have 52 stories that want to be a memoir and they're not. You need to interconnect them. You need to be more open about yourself and who you are. You need to figure out why you were doing these things.
Yeah.
And you need to share that with your readers. And then I said, And, I kind of deep down knew, I already knew she was right before she said that, before I'd even called her. But I had avoided that. A real weakness. For a writer, that's a bad mistake.
Sure.
And I said, give me a couple weeks. So I called her back after spending a lot of time walking in the hills. That's where I do my best thinking. And I said, Candace, I've realized that when I was young, when I first started mountaineering and I was an adventure sailor, I was an explorer, it was about the expeditions. It was about the people I was going with, the friendships I was forging, the experiences I was having, the obstacles I was overcoming, and also, of course, the places I was going, because that's always resonated with me. But over the course of my life, it's become about, in the beginning, the sports I was doing in those places to saving the places where, with my buddies, I was doing the sports. And that's the arc. And she said, take those 52 stories and throw out everything that doesn't have anything to do with that arc.
Yeah.
And then rewrite the book. And that's what I did.
Well.
And then I said, Candace, you're a lawyer. Where'd you ever learn to do this? And she said, oh, that's right. We haven't seen each other for 30 years. I have a side business as an author's coach and editor. So, Ed, how lucky do you get? That is the reason you got to read the book that you did. And I'm so thankful to her.
Yeah. Well, as far as the book goes, I will never even scratch the surface of the adventures you've taken, but I feel like whether you live in Jackson Hole and you do this kind of stuff every day, or you're in an office building in downtown New York. There are lessons in your book about just how powerful finding purpose is, no matter what you do. And like we were saying before I started recording, I mean, that was, it took me really till I was 40. I'm 44 now to fully commit to purpose-driven work, because it was all about trying to make money and do what, you're supposed to do. And when I finally committed to doing something greater than myself, I mean, everything changed, and you can never go back. And so, I think they're just lessons. It's so pronounced in what you do, because it's so, by normal people standards, it's crazy stuff, all these crazy adventures you've done. But the fact that you inject it and that you're driven by purpose, that can be applied to anybody. So again, thank you for writing it.
Yeah, it's not just about ourselves. It's about learning how to be more than ourselves.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, your friend, the writing coach, and I feel like that's another theme in the book, is that you've surrounded yourself throughout your life with really great people, really smart people that'll shoot you straight. And I felt like there are two kind of themes to it. One is this about purpose-driven work, and the other about the power of relationships and the power of really, really deep friendships. And there, right at the beginning, you start talking about when you were young and you met up with Yvon Chouinard, and Doug Thompkins, and they were your mentors. And then throughout the book, you become the mentor to people like Jimmy Chin or Conrad Anker. One question I have about when you see a young person that you want to mentor, you think this person has potential. What is it, or may say specifically about Jimmy Chin, what was it that you saw in him that made you want to be such deep, deep, lifelong friends with?
Well, let's start, with your permission, with what wasn't.
Yeah, please.
And what wasn't there is represented in emails I get with actually disappointing frequency from young people. I got one last week that are to the effect, I read your book, and I'm thinking I want to be a photographer too, and can we have lunch so you can tell me how to do it?
Mm-hmm.
No, I wrote back to that person just last week, and I said, I can't do that because you haven't thought deeply enough about what you want to do yet. You haven't done your own homework.
Mm-hmm.
I understand you're not sure who you are yet or what you want to do. You're at that stage in your life, but everyone in that stage in your life is at that stage in their lives.
Yes.
And to move forward out of that stage and find your own purpose, you've got to do your own part of it as well.
Yes.
You can't just say, let's go have lunch so I can tell you how to do it. It's not a cookbook recipe.
That's great.
And I said, no, I'm not going to have lunch with you. Mm-hmm. And I was harsh, but on purpose, because I didn't hear back from that person. And this is frequent that I get these emails, but I hope that the shock of getting a reply like that will, at least for a few of them, make them pause and think. Mm-hmm. Now, Jimmy, when I first met him, when he was let me back up just a notch. I was on an expedition to northwest Tibet with two of my climbing buddies, Conrad Anker and Galen Rao. There was a third one along, or a fourth including me, David Brashears, another good, super strong climbing buddy. And we were going off onto a really tough trip to try to follow an endangered animal on foot across a 300-mile uninhabited plateau in Tibet to discover their calving grounds, to protect the area before poachers who were taking these animals out could get there first. It was going to be a hard-ass trip.
Oh, yeah.
And David, at the last minute, couldn't make it because he had a conflict with a movie obligation that he had to honor. So Conrad says, hey, I just met this 29-year-old kid named Jimmy Chin, and I was pretty impressed with him. Why don't you call him up and see what you think? So I did. I called up Jimmy, and I just, he was disarming. I had done a little checking up on him. Conrad had as well, and everybody that had been with him, had, high marks for him.
Sure.
And we invited him to join the expedition. But he had told me a story about how he wanted to be a photographer. He had identified that as his path, and then he had done his homework. Mm-hmm. He had really studied outdoor photography and decided that the person he could learn the most from was Galen Rao. Mm-hmm. And he had showed up at Galen's office in the Bay Area in California and asked Galen if they could go have lunch. And Galen said, no, I don't have time, just like I do to people like that. But Jimmy didn't turn away. He camped out in front of Galen's office. And the next day he was there. And Galen went in and go, what the hell? And he says, I just need maybe an hour. And Galen said, and he wouldn't do it. Jimmy stayed there like another day. He wouldn't leave. And finally Galen said, okay. Gave him the hour. And Jimmy learned a ton from Galen, even in that initial meeting. And it set him on his path. So there he was. He was not going to say no. He was tenacious. He had done his homework. He had an idea what he wanted his path to be. And that led to this invitation to go on this trip with Galen, his hero. Yeah. And Jimmy told me after I invited him to come on that trip, he said, my first thought, Rick, was, what did I do to deserve this? And then he said, Rick, about 1 week into pulling that 250-pound rickshaw that you made across this uninhabited expanse through mud, I was pulling that cart up this hill saying, what did I do to deserve this? But that story that Jimmy told me later reveals another answer to your question, and that is his sense of humor and his ability to always see a bright side to any circumstance, regardless of how dark and dim it is. The ability to, always remain positive and optimistic that there's got to be a way forward. There has to be a solution. Those are the attributes and qualities that endeared him to me and the others on that trip. And we were his mentors. That was his first film job. I put him in charge of making the movie. And he says, I've never shot a film camera before. And I told him a phrase I'd learned from my mentor, Doug Thompkins. And I said, well, Jimmy, commit and then figure it out.
I love that.
And that's what he did. And he goes around telling his friends now about that. He often cites that story as, one of the things that got him on his path. So let's fast forward a few years, and I'm in my living room with my wife watching the Academy Award presentation. And Jimmy and his wife, Chai, walk up to the podium with their Oscar for Free Solo. And that was so deeply fulfilling for me. Sorry, I'm getting a little choked up thinking about it. Because mentorship is a two-way street when it really works. And when the student becomes the teacher, well, there's hardly a more proud moment than that.
That's very special. I mean, what a great story. And, I mentioned that your book kind of pushed me to go on Knowles. And one of my instructors is a guy named Brady Robinson, who you may have run into. And Brady, he had just gotten back from a climbing trip to Pakistan doing a first ascent. And he was talking about it the whole time over the first month. He's like, my buddy Jimmy, my climbing partner Jimmy. And then when we finished this section, he showed us a slideshow. It was the late 90s, so they still had slides. And he was showing us, he said, yeah, my buddy Jimmy, we're hoping we can sell a few of these photos. Maybe Mountain Hardware is going to buy a few of them. Or at that point, maybe Mountain Hardware bought one for $500. And I had heard some of the stories about Jimmy camping out in Galen's office. And so I felt like, even though I was fully removed, that I had this view into that trajectory of Jimmy and Brady. They're just both Brady and Jimmy, or I don't know Jimmy, but Brady's the most humble, down to earth kind of guy. And you would imagine that a guy like that would climb with others like that. So it's so neat.
But mentorship, as you pointed out, that is one of the themes of the book. And another fun story I tell on that theme is how when I was invited in my mid-20s to accompany what became only the second American expedition to climb Mount Everest, that led 2 years later to get an invitation to join the first the expedition that made the first American ascent of K2. And I was one of the 4 climbers that got to the top. And a year after that, I got in my mailbox the National Geographic story about our K2 expedition, and I was on the cover. And I remember thinking that, I remember that story of the Everest expedition that I mentioned earlier, and how that photograph of Jim Whittaker had, inspired me to be a climber. And there I was on the cover of an expedition that had been led by my boyhood hero, Jim Whittaker, who was now my friend. And that was only 10 years later. I never could have imagined in 10 years that kind of change could have happened to me. And then I remember thinking, there's a young boy or girl out there somewhere who is getting their National Geographic, and it's going to inspire them just like it did me.
It will.
Yeah. And then years later, it was, if I pause to think, it was about 20 years later, I'm on an expedition in Antarctica with Conrad Anker and Alex Lowe, who are making the first big wall climb ever done in Antarctica. And we got chased off the wall by a snowstorm. And we're down in our base camp, and Conrad says, "Rick, there's something I've been meaning to tell you, but when I was about 12 or 13 or 14 years old, I got the National Geographic in the mail, and there was that photograph of you on the cover on the ridge climbing K2. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I want to be. So I just wanted to thank you for that." And then a year later, the Geographic published a story about our big wall climb in Antarctica, and Conrad was on the cover. And I called him up and said, "Hey, Conrad, congratulations on being cover boy." And he said, "I think I know what you're going to tell me, but tell me anyway." And I said, "That's right. There's a young teenager out there right now that's just getting their magazine in the mail, and they're saying, that's what I'm going to do." So that's what it's about, isn't it? It's passing the baton. It's inspiring, one generation to the next. It's being the teacher and the mentor. But as I said, in other cases like Jimmy, then the student becomes the teacher.
Well, I feel like the operating system that's been passed down, among this lineage of great climbers and adventurers, I feel like you summarize it in the early stages of your book, where you talk about Yvon and Doug calling themselves the Do Boys. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like that operating system of do, take action, go, figure it out, commit and figure it out, I feel like that is so powerful. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the Do Boys. Yeah.
And I met Yvon in the early 70s. I was living closer to Los Angeles, and it was just getting too crowded for me. And plus, there's a bunch of people living there I didn't really care for that much. Movie people in the main. They're people that you think about. You think about actors and actresses, and especially movie stars. Well, essentially, they make their living by pretending to be somebody else. And as an occupation, that doesn't have a whole lot to go for it, unless they're one of those rare people that really inspire you to be better. And there are those actors and actresses, of course, that do that. But anyway, I was disillusioned, and I moved up to Ventura, where Yvon lived, and I got a place right near him.
Yeah.
Mostly so we could surf together. And then we started climbing together, and we became, really good buddies, and we still are. And then he introduced me a few years later to his climbing partner, Doug Thompkins. Mm-hmm. And then the three of us started palling around, going on adventures and expeditions together. And they were older than me. Yvon 10 years, Doug 7 years. And that was enough of an age difference that even in my 30s and into my 40s, they were my guides and mentors. Mm-hmm. But in other ways, we were equals and, close friends as well. It was a mix of the two. But Doug had founded the North Face when he was in his early 20s, when he and Yvon first started climbing together. And then they had journeyed to Patagonia to make the third ascent of a remote and emblematic peak called Fitzroy.
Yep.
And when they got back from that trip, Doug sold the North Face and invested the money into his wife's women's wear business that she had started while they were away on this climb. Mm-hmm. And they rebranded it as Esprit and, built that into $1 billion company. While he was running Esprit, Doug was traveling around the world on business to the company's design studios, one of which was in Japan. And he ran into a comic book there. And as travelers familiar with Japan know, comic books are part of Japanese culture. And this was a comic book about a band of guys, friends, a posse of buddies who went around doing stuff, having adventures. And it was called the Do Boys. That was the English translation.
Yeah.
And Doug loved that, and he applied that moniker to our little posse. So we became the Do Boys. And we went around doing stuff. And it wasn't just going on adventures and climbing mountains and kayaking rivers and lakes and, exploring jungles, because we did all that. But we also were successful business people.
Yeah.
We did that too.
Yeah.
And very successfully. Doug, the North Face, Esprit, Yvon, Patagonia. I had a small company that was a company that licensed reproduction rights to imagery and photography. I left that to join Patagonia, where I had a 15-year run. And all very successful. So, the Du Bois was a good name for us because, as Yvon said, if you're going to make a difference, you got to make that first commitment. Like Doug said too, commit and then figure it out, that you have to act. Mm-hmm. The core of activists is act.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be an activist, whether politically, environmentally, or just the way you run your life, you got to do stuff. Mm-hmm. So it stuck. There was that earlier version of the book, I was thinking of calling the Du Bois, but, I wasn't, it didn't work as well once the book became a real memoir. And besides, by then, in the end of the Trump years, the Proud Boys were taking dominance. And I was afraid that there would be just some kind of a contaminative, cross-reference. And I didn't want that either.
Well, I love that. I read a lot of history, and I love Theodore Roosevelt. He's got his flaws like every historical figure, but one of the things I love about him is his commitment to action. And he had some group when he was as a grown man that he called the Fellowship of the Doers. And I've always thought that's the way to go about life. And I think that's what was missing from the guy you said emailed you, just wanted to get together and get the instruction manual for how to be a successful. You just got to do it. You got to figure it out. And again, another lesson that no matter if you've climbed a mountain or not, you can take from that book. That's wonderful. You mentioned this, and it was going to be my next question about your stint at Patagonia. And so you were obviously very successful in business. You're successful in the mountains. And then you made this decision to go and work at Patagonia. It was obviously very successful. You made a huge impact. But how was that, either the decision process or when you actually went to, because you were going to work for a company, you were going to work for somebody else. And it seemed like up until that point, you had been kind of doing what you wanted to do. And so how did you balance that of going to work at a company with your self-sufficient, self-motivated, self-leadership style that had served you so well?
Well, I had my own company, the photography and film licensing agency, and it was a small business, but I had 20 full-time employees and a few million a year in sales, and it was successful. And I very successfully sold that company in 2000, right on the cusp of the digitization of the industry, because it was in turmoil, and it turned out to be an ideal time to actually sell, because everything was in play. Yeah. There was a lot of money coming into the industry. Sure. From outside investors. So I took advantage of that. The timing was perfect for me. And then I went back to my passion for filmmaking and writing and photography. And I continued to do those things even as I was running my own company. So I actually had two parallel careers at the same time. Yeah. I'd do one for half a day and the other for half a day. Literally, that's how I divided my time. And so I had gone back to those earlier interests and passions. When I was invited first for just a few months to join the board of Patagonia, and then the woman running their environmental affairs and initiatives globally left the company, following her husband who had a new job in another city. And they asked me if I would take over her position, overseeing not just the environmental initiatives, but initially the marketing department as well. So it was a big job. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I said, I don't want to do that. I had never worked for anybody before, as you just pointed out. I'd always been on my own. And plus, I was apprehensive about working for the company that was owned by one of my best friends. Sure. Because I didn't want to get crosswise with him should we have a disagreement about something. Yep. I was really cautious about that. And my wife was, as she always was, my sounding board, my right hand, the one that I really depended to support me in these key decisions, and sometimes even make the decisions for the truth be known. And so she listened to me and my deliberations, and I think she finally lost patience, and she said, Rick, you're always going around telling people and me that you like to try new things, so why don't you just try this thing called having a regular job? And so that was it. I took the job in 2004, and I had a 15-year run there.
Sure.
And I had committed to initial 5-year period. I said, they were apprehensive. Yvon was a little apprehensive too. And then, at the end of those 5 years, I was into it.
Yeah.
And I was adding enough value that they were comfortable keeping me on. So we just kept it going. But it wasn't always easy. And Yvon and I did get into some crosswise a few times. And I did have to learn over time to moderate my tendencies to be kind of, let's just call it autocratic.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense.
One time, Yvon, I found out later, walked over to the company's CEO at the time, and he said, "Good Lord, Ridgeway's gone rogue again on me." and so I had that reputation in the company of kind of just, I wasn't a team player. And by the time I left the company 15 years later, I think I was a good team player.
Were you really?
Yeah, I really taught myself how to do that. And boy, it wasn't easy. I had to learn to listen better than I was before, certainly. And I had to learn to check my ego. And I had to learn that I didn't always have the best ideas. In fact, I seldom did, but occasionally I would have a real good one, as would a lot of other people.
Yeah.
And I learned those things over time. And, I really am, I don't want to say I'm proud, but I'm gratified with the changes that I made during my run at Patagonia. And I know I was able to add a lot of value. I was able to initiate things at the company that are up and running today, including the publishing division that published my book.
Wow, that's great.
And, other things that are still with the company and important components of it, like its warmwear program.
Sure.
And then I started the Sustainable Apparel Coalition while I was there.
Oh, wow, okay.
And that is now the largest trade organization of apparel and footwear companies in the world. And it is organized to create standardized tools to measure the environmental and social justice impact of companies.
Okay, yeah.
And it's become very successful. The coalition ended up, and I was the founding chair and still very involved with it. I started that organization 12 years ago, and it found itself eventually in the business of creating software, and it realized that a trade organization is not the best, it's not a fit-for-purpose organization to make software. So we eventually spun off a for-profit software company.
Nice.
And, that was 2.5 years ago, and that company now has over 100 employees. And it just closed its second round of capital raising. It just raised $50 million. And it is poised now to become the global standard for impact measurement and sustainability for all categories of consumer goods. And it's now my hope that within 2 or 3 years, everybody listening here will go to any store or any online emporium to buy a product, and it will have our rating on it, which is called the HIGG, H-I-G-G. I gave it that name because it didn't mean anything in any of the 130 languages we've researched. And it had 4 letters, and the URLs were all available.
Nice.
So that's why it's called the HIGG, because we got to fill in the meaning ourselves. But it's really going well. So that, to get back to your question, that's another area where I think I was able to add value, and I feel good about that. It's very, very fulfilling. I think I was able to give to the company, and in turn, they did so much for me. I just wouldn't be who I am without that experience, without what I learned there from the wonderful people that work at that company.
A few weeks ago, I had another Patagonia Books author, Dylan Tamina, on, and he's a big conservationist, steelhead fish, and just a wonderful guy. And we were talking about his evolution as a conservationist, and he said a similar thing, that Patagonia played a big role in his evolution as a conservation. Without their influence, he's a better person for having been associated with that company, which I think you can't say that about many companies. Yeah. Coming from a MBA, a reformed MBA student. I mean, that's another question I have, but just about business for you. You've been successful as an entrepreneur. You've been successful working at a very impactful company that's purpose driven. And there's a line in your book where you talk about separating the consequential from the inconsequential. And I love that. But when you're thinking about business, like at Patagonia, it's a big company and there are processes in place. I mean, the ultimate goal is very important, what you're doing, but this is more for me. As a selfish question. How do you in your mind keep your eye on the prize of the big purpose, say in business, without getting frustrated by some of what could be considered inconsequential, the paperwork or the policies and this, because I struggle with that in my conservation job. But I'm very focused on conserving land, but the day-to-day emails and all this kind of systems, it drives me crazy. And so, I mean, how did you keep the important thing in mind, not get bogged down in the inconsequential?
Well, it was pretty easy at Patagonia.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
And I think it's not difficult for just about everybody that works there.
Yeah.
And what's not that difficult is to find the wherewithal to deal with the daily details, the admin stuff.
Because the purpose is so clear? Because
the purpose is so clear and it's there above everything. It's the North Star. And whenever you begin to feel frustrated with the day-to-day grind, as it's commonly called, you can just look up and there's the star and you can see it. And it's shining light on you. And, and you feel better immediately as soon as you remind yourself of that. And that's why it's such a special place to work, because that star is there shining so brightly and clearly and evidently to everybody who's there. A few years ago at the company, we had long made all of our decisions based on the company's mission, which at that time was to build the highest quality product, to build it as we said, with no unnecessary harm.
Yes.
To either people or planet. And then to use the success of the business to give back, to find solutions to the global crises facing us. Well, it was a pretty complicated mission statement, but it was really working because it was an explicit guide on how to make decisions. It was like a very clear framework.
Sure.
And then Yvon came to me one day and he says, I think I want to change the mission. And I said, what? He says, yeah, it's too complicated. And I said, yeah, but it's such a good guide for everybody. Look at what we're killing it with this mission. And he goes, yeah, but things always work better when they're simple. And I said, well, what are you thinking about? He says, I think I want to change it to just saving our home planet, because that's what it's all about. And I go, yeah, but that doesn't guide anybody. And he said, that's the point. Everybody's got to figure it out.
Yeah.
And that is brilliant.
It is.
And I resisted that for a while until, I thought it through enough that I realized how right he was. And especially how right he was to make it ambiguous.
Sure.
While it's not ambiguous at the same time. The goal couldn't be more clear.
Yeah.
How you get to the goal is everybody's challenge to figure out.
And so, having worked, I would argue, the all-star team of climate work, people that are fully committed every day to making an impact. And then your career as an adventurer and as an entrepreneur, seeing some of the wildest places in the world, that some of which have been changed drastically because of climate change. You strike me as an optimist. You are a doer. Give me some hope for this climate change predicament that we're in as your friend.
Yeah. Well, let's back up a bit to answer your question with a framing that's part of the answer, and that's that I left Patagonia early into the pandemic in the summer of 2020.
Okay,
and it was a time that worked out well for them and for me to move on. And I don't use the word retire because I don't use the word retirement, because the core of that is retire, and retire, one definition is to withdraw. And, I hate that idea.
You can't do that. That's impossible for you to do.
I can't do that. But again, at that point in my job at Patagonia, I was the primary spokesperson for the company, going around to events globally, meeting with the press, having interviews like we're doing now. And with the pandemic starting, none of that was going on. There wasn't that much work for me to do. The company was struggling. It was in a downturn, like all companies were, dealing with supply chains and other things, falling sales. And it was just a good time for both of us. So that was 2.5 years ago now. And in that interim, I doubled down on work I was doing for environmental and conservation organizations, several of which I was on the board of. And one of those is a group called One Earth.
Yes.
And it started as a initiative inside the Leo DiCaprio Foundation. And while I was still an employee at Patagonia, they called me up one time and said that they were going to stage an art auction, to raise money for conservation, and they wanted to know if I'd get involved and help them figure out what to do with any money they might raise. I said, "Oh, that sounds like fun." So I got involved in this auction, and I got to, get to know DiCaprio just a little bit, and more importantly, some of his team, including this woman that worked there named Justin Winters. Justin is a she in this case. And I was amazed how successful they were with this auction.
Really?
Leo had talked to some of his art buddies into donating some works. There were 39 different paintings and sculptures. And Christie's I was there at the auction, and they estimated they're going to raise $12 million, maybe 13. And at the end of the last gavel on the last lot, it was just under $40 million. So I got to work with these guys to give away millions of dollars. Some of it to my friends like Doug and Chris Thompkins.
Yeah.
Got $1 million for jaguar conservation in Argentina.
That is so wild. That's the good side of Hollywood,
Another good friend, Eric Good, who runs the Turtle Conservancy, got $1 million to create a tortoise reserve in Mexico.
That's real money for
and I got
nonprofits.
To steer some of that money, and I got really involved with them. So they had two parallel pillars of conservation effort. One was to mitigate climate change, and the other was to scale wildland and wildlife conservation.
Yep.
So I started working with them as they began to figure out and understand the interconnection between those two things, and how one really was dependent on the other to a large degree. You can't really solve climate change without conserving nature and using natural systems as carbon sinks to create a partial solution to climate change.
Yep.
So they got their head around that. And then from my learnings at Patagonia, and this was entirely what I learned from what I'd learned at the company, none of this came on my own. I was learning this from my mentors, Yvon and Rose Macario and others at the company, was how regenerative food production, the production of food and fiber regeneratively grown, is also an important partial solution to climate change. So I introduced that idea to the DiCaprio people. And then they got on it. Man, they started doing their research. They jumped on it. And pretty soon they had developed this 3-pillar strategy for climate change.
Wow.
Of energy, the transformation of fossil fuels to to renewables. The second was the scaling of the conservation of nature. And the third was food, from shifting from industrial food to regenerative food production. And then they used these millions and millions of dollars that they had raised to fund over 40, it was close to 50 of the leading scientists in the world on planet Earth to go deep into each of those 3 pillars and find out how much, where, and when, and at what cost it was going to be to scale those 3 pillars to keep the planet at 1.5 degrees of warming. So then about 2 years ago, Leo, he'd gotten up to his years in running this foundation or overseeing it, even though he wasn't running it. And he wanted to merge it with another group. And Justin took this 3-pillar strategy for climate change and spun it off as its own NGO called One Earth.
Okay.
And I was the founding chair.
Great.
For the last 2 or 3 years, we've been scaling our work even more. And the more we scale it and the more clear it becomes, And what becomes clear is the exact kind of work that we need to do, and to a granular level where we need to do it to keep the planet to 1.5 degrees. And it is a roadmap. And it's all there spelled out. And we've just about got the work done. And now we've got to the next step, of course, is to figure out how to persuade all the policy and decision makers on planet Earth to follow this roadmap. Because what's cool about it is that it's scaling technology that we already have. Every single thing that we've been able to demonstrate scientifically as an action to keep the planet to 1.5 degrees are actions using technology that exists. It's scaling what we're already doing.
That's cool.
And it's completely doable, to use that word again. We can do this. We can save the planet. And so that's part of one of the missions that I'm a small part of, trying to work with dozens and hundreds and thousands of other people to get done. So that's keeping me going. It's getting me up in the morning. I can see a bright light on the horizon line. There's still a hope for all of us and the health of our planet to avoid the cliff.
I love it. I love the energy. I can feel the energy coming off you. I want to get involved. That's great.
Well, you can check out oneearth.org, and so can your listeners, because you can see what we're doing there.
I'll put links on the webpage so people listening can click right through. When I was preparing for this interview, I was watching a few YouTube videos of you. If I weren't preparing for a video, it would have come off as like cyber stalking, but I was really reading up, and I noted there was a presentation you did, and somebody asked a question about the last 2 years under COVID. And I loved your answer. You were talking about how you've been all over the world. You've done some of the biggest peaks in the world, the wildest places, and you've spent the last 2 years really getting to know your own backyard and focusing on kind of the local region that maybe you hadn't paid as close attention to. Could you talk about the last 2 years and what you've learned from this weird COVID situation we're in?
Yeah. And that's just what I did, without that ability to travel as much, which turned out to be a real silver lining. I didn't miss it nearly as much as I thought I would. In fact, not only did not miss it, I relished not having to do it.
Really?
Yeah.
Was that a surprise, or was it?
It was a surprise. Yeah. And instead, being an outdoor guy like you and probably most of the people listening to this, I had to turn to my own backyard and start spending more time hiking in it and exploring and paying attention to the small and the large as well in my own landscape, my backyard landscape. And I have, for many, many years, been a birder. But then with the pandemic, I was able to kind of double down on that emerging passion as well. And birding gave me an entree into the details, the more subtle things in my own backyard landscape that I had previously missed. And then I started paying attention to more classes of animals as well as just the birds. I joined the board of the Turtle Conservancy, before the pandemic several years ago. But then during the pandemic, I moved out of my big house and into a little small house, downsized, and I got a little place right in the middle of the Turtle Conservancy, so I'm surrounded by turtles and tortoises. There's 600 of them around my house from 35 different species.
Wow.
And over 15 of them are among the most endangered on the planet, with many species that are now extinct in the wild, and we've got some of the only remaining individuals left on the whole planet. So I'm going deeper into turtles and tortoises, and I just love that. I'm getting so passionate about that. But paying attention to these animals and really learning about their lives and trying to put yourself inside them as much as any of us can and seeing what the world looks like through their eyes, it's life-changing. It is just a path to get much deeper into wildness and into nature and to really start to understand it. Something else I've learned from bird watching is that, just identifying what bird is what by either sight or sound or both is it's two-dimensional. But then as you start to learn the relationships between the birds and you begin to go a little bit deeper into that and learn more about it, then that introduces a third dimension of time because those relationships have evolved over time.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that understanding the relationships between the birds as well as just their identity,
That's cool.
it becomes a way to see back into the origins of life on Earth.
I love it.
That becomes magical. And all that can come from your own backyard.
I've got 2 little girls, 6 and 4, and we've got our bird book right next to the backyard window, so we can. And that's one of the things we're working on. And I'm learning as much as because I don't know much about birds, so having to teach them is pressure. And so this is a timely conversation. Last question for you. Thank you for your time again. This is awesome.
My pleasure.
It seems that most writers I speak to are also avid readers. And then throughout your books and some of the presentations that I watch on YouTube, I feel like you're always referencing poetry, poets, other authors. And so I was wondering if there've been any authors, books, poets that have played a big role in your development as a human being. And I mean, I'm sure there's more than we could list here, but are there any top ones that come to mind?
Well, I mentioned a minute ago that during the pandemic, I downsized my house from, a larger place to a little tiny house. And, but it has tall ceilings, and 2 of the walls have floor to near ceiling bookcases with library ladders to climb up.
Oh, wow. That's my kind of place.
I was able to move my lifelong collection of books into one room, into a living room, which was magical. I just loved it.
Don't you just love it? Being surrounded by these books?
And like probably all book collectors do and readers, I have my own classification system. And some of the shelves started to get overstuffed with, South America. And then, Arctic exploring started to kind of get pushed out against the ends of that section of the bookcase. And so they didn't all fit. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I was sitting there trying to think this one through. I didn't want to add another bookshelf because the design of the ones I had were just right. And there was this fireplace mantle. It's got a beautiful little fireplace, and it has a long mantle across this fireplace.
Yeah.
And I was looking, and I go, oh, I could put quite a few books on top of that mantle. And then I thought to myself, well, what am I going to put there? And I thought, I'm going to put the books that have influenced me the most in my life.
That's great.
So I have, 20, 30 of them, maybe 40 now up there. The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen, 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence, In Patagonia by Bruce Chatwin.
Oh, yeah.
South by Ernest Shackleton. For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Several of Cormac McCarthy's books. The writers that, have really inspired me through my youth. Silent Spring, Rachel Carlson. And Ed Abbey. And his early books, Desert Solitaire being the most profound of them, in my view. So they're there, and I get to look at them every day, and I'm finding a renewed inspiration. And I've started to pull down a few of them and read them again. Most recently, the Red Badge of Courage.
Oh, that's so good.
So, that's the answer.
I love it. Well, I do the same thing. I keep on my desk, I keep the books in front of me that mean certain things. And I'm not blowing smoke. This book has got a place because it's really important. It's just a beautiful book to look at regardless, but it's important. And the connection that I've had with you and your writing, even though we never met, anyway, I just really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Well, we get in where we started by saying the thanks goes to you because, it's a lot of work to do it. And when it connects to somebody like that, it means a lot to me.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.